He taught at the University of Florida from 1990 to 2010. Then he joined the philosophy department at Indiana University, Bloomington. He is the editor of the volume on Donald Davidson in the Cambridge Contemporary Philosophy in Focus series. And he is co-author with Ernest Laporte on Donald Davidson, Meaning, Truth, Language, and Reality, Oxford University Press. And Donald Davidson's Truth Theoretic Semantics, again, Oxford University Press. And co-editor with Ernest Laporte on of a companion to Davidson, Wiley Blackwell. He is the author, most recently, of 2 books from Oxford University Press on collective agencies. The first one is From Individual to Plural Agency, Collective Action 1. And the second one is From Plural to Institutional Agency, Collective Action 2. And co-editor with Maria Yankovic of the Routledge Handbook of Collective Intentionality, 2018. He also edits collective intentionality category at Field Papers. And according to my notes, also he was my PhD supervisor when I was at Indiana University, Bloomington, doing my PhD. And I just want to say that I am really, I want to extend my sincere gratitude to Professor Ludwig for all his support and help, encouragement. So both friendly and professional and great mentor. So I really feel incredibly lucky that I was his student. I learned a lot, and he's still a great role model, actually. So I want to thank him for that. And by the way, so I address everyone with their first names, but I call Professor Ludwig Professor Ludwig. That's the reason, because I'm used to just addressing him that way. That's why. All right, and so today the title of his speech is From Individual to Institutional Agents.
Thank you so much, Tufan, for that wonderful introduction. We miss you around Bloomington. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen. Let's see, this should work. And let me go ahead and start that. Okay, I hope everybody is seeing that. So as Tufan said, the title of this talk is From Individual to Institutional Agency, and I'll explain a little bit more about that in a moment. I want to begin by thanking the Bilkent University Philosophy Department for the invitation to give this talk. I'm very happy to have the opportunity to do so. And special thanks to Tufan for all of the work that he's done both on the stage and behind the scenes in organizing this conference. And since we should do this at some point, maybe I can entice everybody to join me in, if I can find my, in clapping, a round of applause, collective applause for Tufan for all the work he's done. So. Okay. So let's see, one more thing in an organizational matter. There is a link to a folder with a handout in the PowerPoint slides in the chat box. So if you don't see that there, it may be because you joined after it got put in the chat, and you can just type in the chat that you don't see it, and maybe Tufan can repost the link if that's necessary. Okay, so the assumption that sort of founds the, excuse me for a second, the assumption that is at the basis of this talk is that collective intentionality is an achievement. It requires both conceptual and cognitive resources. And once we've made it to the first stages, we can build on that to create ever more complex levels of collective intentionality. And I'm interested in thinking through what are the conceptual resources that are required, starting with individuals just all doing their own things. How do we get to groups that are working together to do things? And then finally to institutions. And in particular, excuse me, to do this in a slightly different way. So what are the conceptual building blocks of the various stages by which we get from individual agency to joint intentional action all the way to institutional agency? Now, the talk is based on work that I did in these two books, the ones that Tufan mentioned, From Individual to Plural Agency, which is about the kinds of agency of groups we express using plural action sentences and plural attributions of intention, and From Plural to Institutional Agency, which is about the kinds of agency that we express using grammatically singular group action sentences and attributions of intentions to groups like teams and clubs and universities and nation states and so on. And you can see the title of this talk is a kind of compression of these two titles, From Individual to Institutional Agency. This is going to be a big picture talk. I'm interested in the conceptual scaffolding of collective intentionality. And I have here my story about the whole thing in a single diagram. This is probably a little too small to see. I do want to explain some things about the diagram. So I'm going to blow it up a little bit. And let me start by blowing it up at the top. So that should be more visible there. And let me explain really quickly what the arrows mean. So if there's an arrow that goes from X to Y, that means that Y presupposes X. And in most cases, I have in mind the concept of Y presupposes the concept of X. There are going to be also ontological or metaphysical dependencies as well, but mostly I'm interested in tracing out certain kinds of conceptual connections. If there is a sort of squiggly dotted line with an arrow in one end, that means the concept expressed by X is applied in the domain of things that Y applies to, but is not necessary for it. So I'm going to proceed in stages in trying to unfold the conceptual resources required to get to our understanding of institutional agency. And the first stage is going to involve thinking about the connection between singular and collective action, and then how we get from that, the idea of collective action to collective intentional action. And that's going to involve thinking about we intentions and shared intentions. Now this dotted line here really is a line that separates the domain that doesn't involve what I'm thinking of as collective intentionality from the domain that does. So we get collective intentionality not just with collective action, which could be completely unintentional, but when we get shared intentions. So that's a crucial dividing line there. Now let me zoom out a little bit here and then zoom in a little bit lower in this diagram. The next stage is going to get started with a resource that's available once we have the concept of an intentional collective action, and that is the concept of an essentially intentional collective action. And there are going to be two sort of separate topics here. One is once we have essentially intentional collective action in view, we can get organized groups with the division of labor and a further division involving groups of groups, each subgroup of which also has a little bit of work to do in a division of labor. And this will also play a crucial role in understanding the nature of constitutive rules, which I'm going to analyze in terms of a certain type of essentially intentional collective action. That will put us in a position to understand status functions, and that will put us in a position in turn to understand status role, which are certain kinds of status functions assigned to agents in which their agency is crucial to discharging the function. Now, once we've got to that point, we can understand the nature of institutional membership in an institution, and hence the nature of institutions as the kinds of entities which can admit a perpetual succession by having a series of individuals fulfill the same organizational roles. We'll see some of the concepts that appeared earlier applied within the context of institutions. And then a really important concept, that of a proxy agent, which is not necessarily tied to institutional agency, does have an extremely important role in facilitating expressions of institutional agency. So it gets applied within the category of institutions. And then excuse me, there's a, yeah. Excuse me for a moment. I got to go back. Yeah. Okay. And then finally, the zoom function. Little wonky here. And then finally, we're going to look at the topic of legal fiction and the way the idea of a legal person arises from that and how that gets applied within the context of institutions designed for perpetual succession, which makes possible transgenerational social projects with stable functional institutional autonomy. Okay, so that is the big picture. Okay, and we're going to work through it in stages here. And there's going to be a lot of detail I'm going to have to pass over, but what I want to get out on the table and what I hope that you will see at the end is how each stage is built up on the basis of the concepts introduced at earlier stages. And this is going to be a thoroughly individualistic, reductive account of institutional agency, tracing the concepts all the way back to those that appear above the line here. Okay. So stage one is collective action and collective intentional action. And so we're going to be focusing on this part of the story. So this is the main part, but we're going to take it in two stages. First, the analysis of collective action, and I will give what I'm calling the multiple agents account. And then we'll take a look at the idea of a we intention and shared intentions in collective intentional action. And here I'm going to advocate something I call the shared plan account of we intentions and shared intentions. So I'm going to begin with a plural action sentence. And I want to note that a sentence like this admits of two interpretations. One is a distributive reading, where it just means each of us lifted the bench. The other is the collective reading. And on the collective reading, on the distributive reading, we get a kind of, in logical form, a distributive quantifier over members of the group, and then we just feed each one of them into the matrix, X lifted the bench. On the collective reading, you can force it by adding the adverb together, and that means that the complement gets a collective reading. So it means we lifted, we are such that we together lifted the bench, rather than each of us is such that he lifted the bench. Now, the distributive reading is pretty straightforward. I want to exhibit a little bit of the story about the logical form here in order to explain where the ambiguity comes from in a way that shows that collective agency really just reduces to individual agency. So one capital D here is the representation of logical form of 1D. And this part of it is just the kind of a matrix for individual agency, with X being the position for the agent. And so it just says each of us is such that there's some event of which he is the direct agent and only he is the direct agent of it. And it results in, or the event is the going up of a bench. Okay. So this is the consequent event. And built into the direct agency relation is there being some event of which the agent is a primitive agent, which bears a certain relation to the consequent event. Now, I've argued that you can get the collective reading simply by reversing the order of the quantifiers. So giving the event quantifier wide scope over the distributed quantifier. And if you do that and make an adjustment here for the sole agency relation, this is what you get. There's some event such that each of us is a direct agent of it, and only those among us are direct agents of it, and it's the bench going up. Excuse me. So see this, we should get one more thing. Yeah, there we go. So is this right? Intuitively, what happens when two people lift a bench? Well, they each make a contribution to the bench going up. So it seems to capture intuitively what the truth conditions are for we lifted the bench together on the collective reading. Okay, so I claim that's all that's required. And this is also what I call the multiple agents account of collective action. And on this view, the distinction between individual and collective action is just that when you have a whole bunch of agents, each of whom bring about a distinct event, then you have individual actions. But if you have a whole bunch of agents who all make a contribution bringing out a single event, you have collective action. And it's clear that on this account, collective action can be unintentional and not intentional under any description. So a good example of this is our causing global warming. This is something that everyone in industrial society almost is making a contribution to. And so it's something we're doing together, but it's not the case that all of those people are intending to do anything together whatsoever. So this is something that is unintentional and not intentional under any description. Okay, so the multiple agents account in shorthand form for a group of agents to do something together is for them all to make a contribution to something coming about. It's that simple. Okay, now the real innovation comes with shared intention, the capacity to share an intention, do something. So I'm going to stick with our example of lifting the bench. And what we want to do is analyze the sentence, "We intend to lift the bench." Now, this also has two readings. It does have a distributed reading where it just means each of us intends to lift the bench, and that's given in 2D. The collective reading we can fix by saying each of us intends we lift the bench together. So we force the collective reading on the complement. And I read the noun phrase in logical form as involving a distribution over the members of the group because, take two people lifting a bench together. It's clear that the two of them don't make up a new agent of any sort. So whatever we're saying is going on here, it can't involve an agent, which is the group consisting of the two of them. They can't have, the two of them together doesn't have an intention. Each of them individually has an intention. In addition to that, if the analysis of collective action sentences is correct, it's clear there's no group agent involved in lifting a bench. So there shouldn't be a group agent who has as its intention that the bench go up. Now, I'm going to use the term introduced by Tuomola and Miller in 1988, we intention to pick out the kind of intention that someone has who's participating in a group of agents doing something together intentionally. And then the question is, so shared intention is just going to be a distribution of we intentions across members of a group. And the question of the analysis of shared intention then comes down to the question of how to analyze the matrix here, the we intention, X intends, we lift the bench together. Now, there are two basic kinds of accounts here. There are mode accounts and there are content accounts. Mode accounts are held by Margaret Gilbert, whose notion of a joint commitment is supposed to be a sui generis concept that arises in the context of group action. And the individual slice of that is going to be a special mode of commitment that is not an individual commitment. John Searle also has at least said that he accepts some kind of mode account. Whether it holds up when you look at the details is another question. On the content side, there are two basic approaches. You could hold that the difference between I intentions and we intentions has to do with the content, but the content contains certain kinds of sui generis notions that can't be reduced to the concepts that are already available in thinking about individual agency. So Raimo Tuomola is the most famous advocate of a view like this, and I'll say a little bit about his view in a moment. On the other side, there are accounts that seek to show what's special about we intentions by telling a story about the content, but not one that uses any concepts that aren't already available in our understanding of individual agency. So Bratman, of course, falls in this category, and my account also is of this sort. Okay, so I'm going to say a little bit about why I think we shouldn't go with the mode account, but should go with the content account. If you accept a mode account, and you also accept that our ordinary attributions of intentions to people when they intend to do something together, when they share an intention, correctly represents what's going on, then you're committed to saying that the verb intend is ambiguous between a kind of I mode reading and a kind of we mode reading. And if that's right, we can test for that ambiguity thesis. So consider the sentence, he left the room and he left the building. Okay, now, given that the verb left there is interpreted the same way, you can abbreviate that by eliding the verb in the second clause, and you get he left the room and the building. Okay, and that sounds perfectly okay. However, you could have the same word across two clauses where the verb doesn't get interpreted in the same way. And in that circumstance, the abbreviation is illicit. So an example is 5. He left his hat and he left the room. And those don't mean the same thing. And then when you try to do the abbreviation, what happens is you get what's called a zeugma. He left his hat and the room, and we're sort of jarred by the move because we recognize that we have to interpret left differently with the object hat than with the object room. So we can try this for intention and see whether it generates a zeugma. So consider 3. They intended to lift the bench together, and they intended to lift the bench individually. So the thesis is that intended means the same thing in both places. If that's right, then we should be able to do the abbreviation. They intended to lift the bench together and individually without it jarring us in the way he left his hat and the room does. And indeed, that's so. It doesn't generate a zeugma. So I'm going to say mode accounts, not the way to go. Okay. Okay, so we're on the content branch of the tree here, and I'm going to go pretty quickly here because we'll be pressed for time. I just want to illustrate what is, where in Raimo Tuomo's account, the circularity or the use of a concept that has to be treated as sui generis comes in. There are a number of different places, but the most prominent place is in the first clause of his account. He says, a member of a collective, we intend to do something if and only if that member intends to do his part of that. And then there's this modifier as his part of it. And he was, Searle famously introduced a counterexample to this account if it were supposed to be reductive. And at a response, Raimo said that he didn't intend it to be reductive, but as his part of X was to be read as his part of X as a joint intentional action, or as his part of their doing X intentionally. And he characterized that as a pre-theoretic notion. And so he's treating it basically as something that's irreducible, that you can't get rid of. And he said the account's not viciously circular because it articulates structure that the basic story doesn't get in the picture. Okay. Now, I think the best response to the claim that it's sui generis is to give an account that actually shows you can reduce the notion to notions that are already in play before we get thinking about shared intention. So with that in mind, there's Bratman's account, which here, what I've done is isolate from his characterization of notions like shared cooperative activity or modus sociality, the core component that presumably be present in all forms of joint intentional action. And the basic idea is that for us to share an intention to do something is for us to have certain kinds of interlocking intentions. And the core of the idea is just that, if a group G intends to J, then every member of G intends that the group J, and each member also intends the group J by way of the intentions of each member of the group J. And this is the crucial component here that gets in the idea of cooperation, and intends the subplans associated with the intentions of each member of G, that GJ, mesh, which means that they should be consistent with one another. So that last clause is the sort of the central insight that Bratman has about the nature of shared intention. Okay, now the last view I want to look at is Ludwig's shared plan account. And I follow Ludwig in most of these things, just to let you know. And I'm going to say a little bit about the relation of this to Bratman's account, but let me just give you what the idea is. And I arrived at this by a kind of linguistic analysis of attributions of individual intentions and thinking about how that gets projected to the plural case. Here's the idea. For any group that intends to J, or any group intends to J, just in case every member of the group intends to bring it about in accordance with the plan that he has at the time of action. So that gets in the idea that you have to intend to yourself do something if you're going to participate in group intentional action, but intends to bring it about in accordance with the plan that he has at the time of action, that, and this is the crucial thing, and this is wide scope, there be a collective action plan P such that each member of G acts in accordance with P in contributing to bringing it about that GJ, and no one who's not a member of the group does. Okay. So this I call the shared plan account for brief, and it's the idea that we're going to, if we all intend that at the time of action we be acting in accordance with the same plan, then we share an intention to do something together. Another way of putting it, sort of a little rougher, but intuitively the right idea, is that if we share an intention, then we really do intend to be on the same page about what we're doing at the time that we're acting. And this rules out any forms of deception, you can see. In a lot of the cases motivating the additional elements in an analysis of shared intention have to do with how to rule out cases of deception. So in slogan form, X, we intends GJ if and only if X intends GJ in accordance with the shared plan. So that's why I call it the shared plan account. Okay, so let's see. Okay, I'm going to touch very quickly on two objections that you might have at this point. I'm not going to go into them in great detail. But I think it's worthwhile saying just a little bit about them, and it'll also serve as a springboard for the next thing I want to talk about. So an objection I've heard to my account and also to Bratman's account is that it's over intellectualized. So young children, we think, can engage in joint intentional activities, and so can non-linguistic animals. And you might wonder, are kids or animals really thinking when they intend to do something with others that I intend to do something in accordance with a plan I have at the time of action, to make the case that there's some plan such that all of us act in accordance with it. So if you think about it in terms of children or animals trying to sort of get this complicated formula in their head, you might think that sounds kind of puzzling or counterintuitive. A first observation about this, of course, is that we can operate with concepts without actually having any kind of articulated story about what their structure is. And for the most part, we do that. Philosophy would be a lot easier if we're just transparent what the structure of our concepts were if we're able to possess them and deploy them in thought. But that's just not so. So we shouldn't be misled by the complication of the articulated story into thinking that you can't possess the concept unless you can tell the story. That's just not so. And are there really any sort of super complicated concepts that go into it? Well, there's a concept of more than one agent. There's a concept of causation. There's a concept of agents making contributions to things coming about. All that's enough for the idea of collective action. Plans and intentions are already implicated in attributing individual action. On my account, there's no mutual belief requirement, and plans could be really simple. They don't have to be complicated. So I think that there's really, if you're going to protest that children and non-linguistic animals can't have we intentions, you should also be prepared to protest that they can't have I intentions either, but nobody says that. Okay, so I'm not going to say more about that, but I do want to look at another objection, and that is that the account given is going to break down when we turn from cooperative neutral act types to those which are essentially intentional collective action types. So things like dancing the tango, which you can't do unintentionally, shaking hands, or playing chess. And the worry is that it makes the account circular if you embed these types of concepts in the content of the intention, and maybe that it implies that we intend to intend. Now, I want to first make the observation that this isn't a problem specifically for the context of collective action, because they're essentially intentional individual action types as well. So for example, playing solitaire is obviously, solitaire is, you know, a kind of activity that only an individual plays by himself. But it is essentially intentional. You're not playing solitaire if you just, you know, randomly moving cards around in a pattern that happens to exemplify solitaire without intending to actually follow the rules of solitaire. So whatever the problem is, it's not special to collective intentional action. Now, the second thing to say about it is that we can show why it doesn't create a problem for a reductive account of intention by seeing that essentially intentional action types in general just involve the idea of, well, they're going to be two sorts of things. But let's think about something like shaking hands or playing solitaire. It involves the idea of implementing a certain pattern of action together with it's being done intentionally. And so from the point of view of thinking about how you could intend to do something like that, first you have the idea of the pattern, which is neutral with respect to intention. If you intend to do it intentionally, that's okay. That just means that when you're planning, you form an intention to implement the pattern, and then the rest of it takes care of itself. Okay, it comes for free. That also explains why you don't have to intend in order to intend to do something intentionally. You just have to intend to do the thing intentionally, and then in planning, you just plan to do the activity pattern, and everything else just follows for free. Okay, so this is a staging point now for thinking about essentially intentional collective activity types, which is going to play a significant role in the subsequent story. So I'm going to divide these into two different types. There will be what I'm calling essentially intentional collective activity patterns, like the waltz, which is a very specific kind of joint activity pattern. There's a collective action plan that you follow and you get taught, or something like checkers, where the patterns are anything compatible with rules given the starting points. Okay, and each of these concepts is going to consist of a specification, a neutral specification of activity pattern, or a set of patterns, plus the requirement they be instantiated intentionally. There's another type of essentially intentional activity types, which are characterized in terms of intentional pursuit of a goal. So these are essentially intentional collective activity targets, as I'm going to call them, or my abbreviations are ICAP for the essentially intentional collective activity pattern, and ICAT for essentially intentional collective activity targets. So examples of these are things like looking for your lost keys or waiting for the second coming. Now, there's no particular path because it all depends on the context. These are actually intentional because they're characterized in terms of activities that are directed toward pursuing a certain goal intentionally. No problem in practice because in any context, when you do the planning focuses on activities that are not characterized as essentially intentional. Okay, so we're going to come back to this, and the ICAPs in particular are going to play an important role in explaining the notion of a status function and also explaining constitutive rules. But I'm going to take a little detour to talk about a different part of the chart. Okay, so we're going to be talking about organized groups that aren't yet institutional groups. And I think this is a stage in the sort of conceptual development of the layered world of collective intentionality that we live in that feeds into our understanding of how institutions are structured. But we'll need additional ingredients to get to institutions. So I'm going to be looking at this portion of our diagram now. the idea of an organized group, as I'm thinking of it, is going to be a group which is organized for some sort of task conceived of as something to be done intentionally. So we're thinking about essentially intentional collective action types, but involves essentially a kind of division of labor. So drive and ambush hunting is a really simple example of this. And then there are various dimensions along which this kind of thing gets more complex. There's the complexity of task decomposition into distinct roles, decomposition of task into a series of organized activities, the number of agents involved in the activity, the regularity with which it's carried out. And then, importantly, the assignment of subtasks to distinct subgroups, which are themselves organized by a division of labor. And so once we have the idea of organized groups with a division of labor, of course, we can have the idea of groups, and then that leads to the possibility of assigning to a group subgroups which themselves are given roles, and then themselves can be involve division of labor, can themselves also involve division of labor into smaller groups, and so on. And so you can see you get enormously complex forms of organized groups with the division of labor with these simple materials. Okay. Now, this does introduce a little bit of ontology, and I want to say just a tiny bit about that. So it is part of the ontology of this story that there are groups. And this seems to me obvious. They're not just groups of agents, there are all sorts of groups. Take one of these rows in my bookshelf behind me and think of the books on one of the shelves. That's a group, right? It's a group of books, right? Now, groups are, as I'm thinking of it, constructed out of things that are not groups. So we have, you might say, groups of level 0, which are just entities, okay? Yes, okay, right, sorry. This may be a little confusing. So there are just entities, which are things, and then there are groups of entities, and groups of entities are what I'm going to be calling, simple groups are just groups of entities. Groups that have groups with level 0, with just entities as members are going to be level 1 groups or level 2 groups. And, oh, I see. I should have started at the bottom here. Wow, okay. So we start with individuals. And we get groups of individuals. Then we get groups of individuals, plus individuals maybe. So anything at the lower stages here or here. And then at the next stage, anything at these stages can be members of groups. And so we get a hierarchy of groups, starting with entities at level 0 and going on up. Okay. So that's going to be part of the ontology, groups of groups of groups and so on. I've heard criticisms of treating the subject terms of action sentences as groups on the grounds that it'll generate some kind of set theoretic-like paradox. But since this is constructive, it obviously doesn't generate any paradox whatsoever. And this is completely adequate to anything we might say about groups doing things. Okay, so slight illustration there. Okay, so we're going to talk about the next section of this diagram. And maybe I'll speed up just a little bit because I think it might be pressed a little bit for time. So I want to explain the notion of constitutive rule in terms of the notion of an essentially intentional collective action type. And I'm going to explain the notion of status function in terms of the notion of constitutive rule, and then status roles as a special and rather interesting type of status function that is a kind of conceptual innovation of an interesting sort once you've got the idea of a status function on the table. Okay, so let's start with constitutive rules. Take chess as an example. The rules of chess are constitutive rules in the sense that there wouldn't be any such thing as chess unless there were the rules of chess and people who intended to play chess in accordance with the rules. What makes them constitutive? Okay, well, the only thing it could be is that the type of activity that they govern is defined in terms of the activity being created by the rules being followed. And that makes sense since you can divide the concept into, first of all, a pattern of activity, namely the pattern, the set of patterns that are compatible with the rules of chess, and the requirement that that pattern be instantiated by two people in accord by their following the rules. Okay, so you do it that way, and what you get is that constitutive rules are constitutive relative to an activity type defined in terms of a neutral pattern of activity and the requirement that it be brought into existence by agents following the rules. This works for the individual case solitaire as well as bridge or chess and so on. Now, a test. If this is right, then any regulative rules should be such that there's some action type relative to which they're constitutive rules. So take Robert's Rules of Order, which govern activity, meetings which could be carried out independently of being followed. Then define a parliamentary meeting as one that is instantiated in virtue of people following Robert's Rules of Order. And then Robert's Rules of Order are constitutive of what I'm calling parliamentary meetings. Okay. Now, once we have this on the table, we can, again, think about chess as an example here. We can characterize essentially intentional action patterns involving items that play a role in the activity pattern without actually specifying what the item is that's to play the role in that activity pattern. So we can use constitutive rules to define functional roles for objects in social interactions between people. And when we do that, we present people who want to instantiate that activity type with a coordination problem. And the problem is to coordinate on exactly the same items for fulfilling those roles. And when you settle on something to play the role, you can see that the participants, in effect, are, to use Searle's phrase, collectively accepting that object for that role. And that is what Searle called a status function. It is a function that an object has that it can perform only insofar as it's been collectively accepted that it has that function. So this gives us an explanation of why objects that have status functions have that special feature, that they can fulfill their role only insofar as it's collectively accepted that they have that role. And it's because the concept of the function is explained in terms of a functional role without a specification of what objects are to have it in the collective activity that it's supposed to play a role in it. So chess piece is a great example. This is a knee-high knight in Harvard Square. And this is one of the very first chess sets. This is also a knight. And as I said, okay, I went over this, requires solving a coordination problem and collectively accepting something for the role. So this explains, let me say one more thing here. That is, if you are on a long train trip and you don't have a chess set, you might press into service bottle caps or annotated pieces of paper for the purpose of playing chess. If you decide that you love playing chess with the bottle caps, and you and your partner may then just adopt a kind of generalized we intention to use those items when you play chess in the future. Now that turns out to be that generalized policy with respect to using those items is kind of convention with respect to their use as chess pieces. So conventions arise for the assignment of status functions to objects when we adopt general policies with respect to using particular items or types of items in those roles. And this could be a small community like 2 people, or it could be a very large community like Turkey or the United States. So conventions regarding the use of currency, for example, are conventions that are at play in really large communities. So all this explains why there's endless variety in chess sets and what you can use to play chess, as well as the boards, because they're just functionally defined. And anything we can press into service that has relevant physical characteristics, be manipulated in the right ways, and which has the relevant functional structure, can be used for the purpose. One of my favorites is the Braille chess set up here. Okay, so let me see where we are. Okay, I'll try to get us through the rest of this pretty quickly. The idea of a status role is a special type of status function, and it's assigned to an agent, specifically to an agent. Only an agent can have a status role because the function assigned requires the occupier to exercise her agency in that capacity. And these roles are interdefined, and they give people powers in virtue of having them. Powers for directing or giving permissions to others, or exercising rights, making findings that have an official status, issuing rules, or conferring, importantly, status roles on other persons or other things. So in that sense, since they always make reference to others in their status roles, they're interdefined. Okay, very briefly, so this summarizes what I just said. I'm just going to let you look at that for a second. And then I want to distinguish several different kinds of status roles. They're what I call agent status. There are, well, pure status roles over here. And among those are what I'm calling agent status roles, where the possessor of the role is part of the group that collectively accepts that the person has that role. There are also what I'm calling patient status roles or subject status roles, where the agent possessing the role is not party to the collective acceptance by which the person has that role, but there are still expectations of them with respect to their behavior in various circumstances, which would be enforced by external incentives like the threat of punishment. There are some status roles that have a mixed character, agent-patient status roles. So acceptance is presumed, but provisions made for when acceptance is absent. So criminal defendants, adult citizens are like this. Okay, so this brings us to the point where I can say something about institutions. So we're going to work on the last 3 boxes here. Proxy agents, institutions, nature of institutional membership in institutions, and the idea of legal fiction and legal persons. Now, let me start with proxy agents. So the key thing about a proxy agent is that the proxy agent is a representative of a group whose acts signify or whose acts are tantamount to the group acting. So a straightforward example is the example of a spokesperson who, when the spokesperson speaks, the group is taken to make a statement or announcement and so on. Now, this works because there are arrangements with those they're supposed to interact with. So if you didn't know about the arrangement, you know, the way that the spokesperson is supposed to work, the person stands up and says something, you don't realize the group has announced anything. So if you want it to work, those it's supposed to interact with have to be in on what the arrangements are. And so this means that the group whose collective acceptance makes it the case that someone is a spokesperson includes not just the group that appoints the spokesperson, but also the group that is the consumer of what the spokesperson says. So it's a community-wide set of arrangements. Okay, and that's Jen Psaki, Biden's spokesperson. And in the case of the spokesperson, this structure sort of generalizes. We've got the Intergroup Agreement on a convention for group announcement to convey a commitment of group members to the message. The group authorizes the spokesperson. That's essential for the spokesperson being a representative of the group. So there's an intergroup agreement on the spokesperson and the message. And in virtue of that, the members of the group which appoints the spokesperson are both in part causal, but also constitutive agents of the group announcement. So when the spokesperson speaks in her role as spokesperson, her utterance act has a status function, which is that of a group announcement. And it's in virtue of that authorization relation that what she does expresses the agency of the group. So that individual utterance act acquires a status function of being a group announcement in virtue of her acting in her role authorized by the group. And it functions because there is that intergroup agreement with the audience. Okay, and that pattern generalizes to all interactions carried out by groups through proxy agents with other individuals and groups. Okay, what do we have to do? Let me talk a little bit about this. So institutions are basically networks of interrelated status roles which are designed for joint action. You can think about, say, military institutions as a kind of paradigm example of that, where they're very well-defined status roles in a hierarchy. Each role has its powers clearly defined in relation to the others. And of course, they are organized for certain kinds of activities, namely state-level violence. Now, when the condition for membership is time indexed, then that makes provision for the transference of the role to others. So whatever the condition is for membership in a court, for example, or an army, if it's a condition that can apply to people, not just an initial group of people, but to a series of people, then you have the basic conditions required for an institution that has perpetual existence or perpetual succession. There can also be institutions which have institutions as members and so on, the United Nations, the European Union, the American Association of Advertising Agencies. And the final ingredient in all of this I want to talk about is the idea of a legal fiction. And the importance of this lies largely in understanding a lot of the language of institutions in the modern world, because almost every significant institution we talk about, well, let's see, maybe that's too much. Most of the most significant institutions we talk about, nation states, corporations, universities, city governments, and so on, they are legal persons. And their designation as legal persons changes the pattern of speech in ways that make it appear as if they are distinct from those people who actually realize the institution. Okay, so it's important to understand, what that idea of a legal person comes to understand what's going on there. So first, the idea of a legal fiction in general. It's a pretense in the law that a thing of one type is another in order to bring to bear a body of law that's already been developed for the purpose of convenience or to serve certain practical purposes. So let me give you an example. So in some jurisdictions, when a couple adopts a child, a new birth certificate is issued in the name of the adopting couple. Now, this is a legal fiction in the sense that it doesn't make the adopting couple the biological parents of the child, But the effect of it is to transfer to them all the rights of the birth parents. The birth parents originally had to the adoptive parents. So that's an example of a legal fiction that is supposed to be a convenience of the law, because you don't have to develop a new set of regulations in order to say for the adoptive parents what their rights are with respect to the child. You just transfer them in one stroke to the adoptive parents by issuing a new birth certificate. So that's the idea. Okay, now what about the idea of legal persons? Or legal personhood. The basic idea is that if for certain limited purposes, you can enter the names of certain kinds of entities into the position of the contractors in contract law, you can achieve in a efficient way certain practical aims that are designed to facilitate a certain form of business. So the idea is that if the law uses the name of the corporation as if it were the entity that entered into contracts and owned property and so on, you treat it also as the relevant target for creditors. And so you protect the shareholders, if it's a for-profit corporation, from having their personal assets taken away from them when the corporation is sued. So the idea of a legal person is introduced in order to affect a desirable property for people investing in a business, which is limited liability. At the same time, if the shareholders are sued by their creditors, they can't go after the corporation because in language of law, it's treated as someone separate from the shareholders. And so it gives the enterprise business stability at the same time that it gives, because you can sue someone and you can take their shares, but you can't liquidate them. You can only sell them. So it protects the corporation from the creditors for the shareholders. It protects the shareholders from the creditors of the corporation. And then you can see there are similar sorts of virtues in protecting governmental officials from lawsuits directed at the government, or the government from lawsuits directed at governmental officials as well, which is why governments are treated as legal persons also. But the ultimate effect of this is just to give contract language a kind of a kind of technical sense, whose meaning is to be cast out in terms of the actual legal procedures for conducting the business. So there's a kind of misleading surface appearance of all of this talk, which treats corporations as entities separate from the people who realize them, but in fact, it's merely a business form under which they conduct business. A general partnership can incorporate and then turn back into a general partnership, and it's the same group of people just doing business under various different forms. It becomes really transparent that you don't get any extra ontology out of this when you think about the case of an individual who incorporates, for example, an author. In that case, the corporation is treated separately from the author, but nobody thinks there's another person around, right? But the legal significance is the same. The technical sense is the same. If it doesn't generate a new entity in the case of the author incorporates, it doesn't when you've got 100,000 shareholders either. I think that I should stop there. There's more to be said about the relation of corporations to shareholders. Basically, corporation is a shareholder, and in corporations that separate management and ownership, the management are proxy agents of the shareholders. But we can talk about that more if you like. So that takes us back to the big picture, and I'm going to stop there for Tufan's comments.
Thank you very much. Yes, so now I will have some comments. It will be short though, so that people can have the opportunity to ask questions. And then if we have time, then the rest of my comments, maybe I can ask as a question. So I want to give two cases, and I wonder if they would count as collective intentional actions according to your shared plan account. Do they have we intentions? So these are not objections actually to your account, but it's more like a clarificatory question actually. So how would you diagnose these cases? The first one is, let's say there are 5 people, 5 friends. One of them is Bob, and the other 4 wants to kill Bob, so they're not very good friends, right? So the 4 people wants to kill Bob, okay, but they don't have a plan yet. They don't have a plan, but they are conspiring, thinking. They are at dinner one day, still no plan to kill him. There is an intention. There is an intention to have a plan, but not yet the plan. They are dining there together, and then suddenly Bob starts choking on food, right? And then they look at each other. These 4, they look at each other, and then they say, "Okay." So they just, communicate with each other by looking at each other, and they decide to just let him die, right? They say with their eyes, "This is good for him." Now, in this case, I think there is a shared intention here, which is letting him die. So because he's asking for help, and normally people would help, and they could, but they decide not to collectively. So we shouldn't, right? Help, not just me as an individual. I'm looking at the others. We should let this happen, right? This is what we want. So then there is an intention, I think shared intention, I think we intention. It seems here about letting, but no action. So would this count as a case of collective action? Because there is no action, but now you can say, of course, this is like a causation without omission, or metaphysics of action and inaction, maybe even doing and allowing. Or Bill in his talk, he mentioned, for example, action and outcome. So maybe this might be a instance of a larger issue, larger metaphysical issue about action, inaction, and all that. But still, would this be, how would this be diagnosed in your account? I think that might clarify the we intentions and shared intentions. And the second case, the last one. Again, this time they are all good friends. These 5 friends, they are all good friends. But Bob again is choking. He does that, right? So Bob again is choking, and now the other 4 they see this, and they all know the Heimlich maneuver. But again, they are looking at each other, and now they are looking at each other because if 2 of them at the same time try to apply the Heimlich maneuver, then they will not be able to save him, actually. So one of them must. Now they are looking at each other. Who should do it? Right? Will you do it? Is he doing it? Should I do it? Right? They are trying to decide, but they are communicating and they are looking at each other. So then in this case, they all want to help, but only one person can help. They are looking at each other. And is there now a shared intention, like we should save him? However, the way we should save him is only one of us acts, right? So then one of us should do something. Would that count as a shared intention? So is one of us should do something a kind of we intention? Because, and then another question may be that one person who is not determined, and whoever takes the initiative will become that person. But could that person be interpreted as the maybe proxy agent for the group? So like one of us should do something, and then they are looking at each other and try to decide. So then an interesting thing maybe here, based on this kind of shared, let's say, it looks to me there is a shared intention here. Based on that, one of them just jumped and okay, the others let him, the person who intervenes. But only one person acted, actually, not the others. And should we say that the person who acted, let's call him L, right? L saves Bob. Did L save Bob, or did the group save Bob? Because if we say there is a group, is this a collective action, intentional action? Okay, I think that's all. They're just 2 cases, and
Okay, great, thanks. Those are interesting cases. So, so we need a story about negative action, right? And sometimes, you know, so if I peek through the curtains and someone's knocking on the door I don't want to talk to, I don't open the door, and we would call that a negative action. But you might say, what is the action? Because I didn't do anything, did I? Now, I do have a story about negative actions in general, which is that negative actions always, there's no unintentional negative actions. They're always things that you intend to do. So in this case, I intend to put myself in a state such that I don't open the door, given this guy's out there knocking on it. So the logical form is going to be the same, except instead of an event variable, you're going to get a state variable. So that's my story about how this works. So, you know, I take a vow of silence, then I'm doing something. I'm not speaking ever, right? And it's sort of a generalized intention as well. So for no time in the future am I ever going to speak. But the effect of the intention is to set up a state in me that disposes me to, only really makes sense if I'm inclined to speak, but it disposes me to keep me from speaking. So here I'm thinking the agency relation that's expressed in the basic logical form of action sentence relates me to a state rather than to an event. And in many cases, it'll be state of myself. Now, how do we apply that to the case you described involving the four people who see Bob as choking and they look at one another and they say, ooh, great, we don't have, all we have to do is do nothing, right? Now, I'm not quite sure how to think about the psychological details of a case like that. And I think that's, what the details come out like really would tell the story here. If it's me sitting there watching, I plan to, just an individual, I plan to kill Bob. And, I haven't really, worked out any details, and we're having lunch and he starts choking and I just smile at him. Here it intersects with a question about the relation between negative action and recognized duties. So if I recognize I have a duty to something, do something, and I intentionally don't fulfill the duty, is that ipso facto a negative action? Now, if it is, then I think in the individual case, when I decide I'm not going to help him, not going to fulfill the duty to help, then I have done something, a negative action. And I'd give the story that I gave you a moment ago, like the vow of silence. And then the same thing could apply to a group of people. They all look at each other and they decide jointly, we are not going to intervene. And then they are involved in doing a joint negative action. Not quite sure how to think about the failure to perform duty ipso facto being a negative action, but that's what it hinges on, I think. Now, so no event, but negative action. And then I'm going to tell the story about the intention generated a state that prevents you from doing something. What about the other interesting case involving, Bob choking? His four friends are there, and if more than one intervenes, they'll screw it up and he'll die. So there they have an interesting kind of collectivizing problem. They have to collectivize their agency, but not to cooperate together, but to make sure that they don't, no more than one person intervenes when they know that every one of them wants to intervene. Now, I think that, again, the psychological details in the particular circumstance matters, but they could well form an intention to make a decision about who's going to do it. And then that could lead to one person being the one to do it. And then the other questions you want to ask arise at that point. What did they do intentionally? They made a decision about who's going to do it. But the person who actually does it, given the way saved works, is the one who saved him. But they're all agents of the saving because they all had a causal role, causal agential role in the saving. But the agential relation that the verb save expresses requires that the agency be direct and not through anyone else. In the same way, if you hire someone to kill someone else, you're an agent of the death, but you didn't kill the person. So I think it's like that case. Does that answer all the questions? Oh, proxy agent. No, not a proxy agent because it's not a status role.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much. Now, for your questions, again, from the reactions at the bottom of the screen, you can just press raise hand. Sade?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for the presentation. I also had a question about the proxy agents. So when you, like, I understand it very clearly when you're talking about like a press secretary and they are giving in the government's like view, and you said that they have to have this intergroup agreement on the content of the statement, and then this person is a spokesperson. But then you also said with corporations that basically the managers are proxy agents for shareholders. And I was just wondering that it just seems to be like, you know, in a way, yeah, sure they are, you know, they are there running the company on their behalf. And then there's shareholders annual meetings, you know, where they decide certain like guidelines for what they're allowed to do and things. But it just seems to me that they're still like how wide is your category of proxy agents? Basically, that's what I'm thinking, because it seems to be that they have a much more leeway than that kind of spokesperson, press secretary, but also that they have much more kind of also responsibility in the sense, because like it's such a wide scope that the shareholders are usually giving. Of course, you can have very active shareholders, but then you can also have a lot of like companies that just maybe most of the shareholders are held through some other fund or, you know, and then it's kind of, or like pension fund or something. And then it kind of boils down to just that they want to make some sort of profit on their investment, you know? And then it just seems that there's a lot of other also like kind of stakeholders whose voices are kind of more important for the proxy agents to take into account, at least according to a lot of kind of the kind of corporate responsibility theory. So I'm just wondering, like, and then these proxy agent managers have a lot of leeway. So how wide is your kind of concept of proxy agents?
It is a super flexible concept. What I'm aiming to describe are the sort of conceptual ingredients that go into it. We often use the notion of representation to express, or formal representation to express the idea of proxy agency. But you can give proxy agents powers, right? Even the spokesperson. You can give the spokesperson a lot of autonomy in representing her principal. And this is typical of press conferences. Sometimes they read from a statement, sometimes they say formally so-and-so, but very often they just stand up and answer questions. And they've been authorized to do that on behalf of their principal. And they're given a lot of leeway in how to do it. They choose the words and so on. And they are, in that capacity, representing their principal. And the way we describe the principal's commitments abstract a little bit from the particular words that people use, because they recognize that given the autonomy, the intentions of the principal with respect to the content don't go down to the level of detail of the actual words used, but only to the general spirit of what's being said. But you can see that you can also give other powers to proxy agents, like they can have the power of making decisions for you. And this occurs in the individual case when you give someone a power of attorney to, for example, a very broad power of attorney to manage your finances. And then their decisions are legal decisions for you, right? And that's because you've given the power to do that. So this is the model also for thinking about the shareholder-manager relation. And these arrangements have evolved over a very long period of time. And it's useful to think about how they evolve over time to the sort of really super autonomous management structure and employee structure that is characteristic of modern transnational corporations. But corporations the shareholders can incorporate, they can manage their own business. Then by stages, they can introduce, employees, managers under the employees. Finally, you know, a CEO and they're the board. Finally, they can appoint a board and just sit back and, you know, so it's all part of a continuum of giving agents more and more autonomy with respect to managing one's business. And then we end up with these corporations that, you know, around for hundreds of years, and the shareholders cycle through them, and the proxy agents operate as a kind of independent institutional entity. But legally, it's the shareholders.
Bill?
Yeah, so I missed a lot of this for sort of technical reasons, but I wanted to ask about what you said at the end about the one-person corporation. Okay, because you seem to sort of present this as sort of, you like, sort of a reductio of the idea that, you know, when you incorporate, you create a new entity. So, well, nobody thinks that's the case in the case of the one-person corporation. Yeah. So, I mean, one thing that struck me about that is, look, I mean, we often don't have a worry about the idea that there can be more than one entity there, when intuitively, to the philosophically unreflective person, it might seem as there's only one entity there. So, you know, we think there's no problem with the idea that, you know, Kirk is one thing and the singleton set of Kirk, that's another thing. Yeah. We have no difficulty with the idea that, you know, you've got the statue and the matter of the statue. And you know, we have various ways of different identity conditions, different persistence conditions, and so on. Yeah. Why isn't the case of the one-person corporation just like that? You know, the corporation comes into existence when it's sort of legally founded and legally dissolved, but I don't come into existence when the corporation is legally founded and legally dissolved. Fine, you know, we've got two identities there, two entities there, just as we do when we have, you know, the statue and its matter, or, well, you get the point.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, good question. Well, you could have a general metaphysical view according to which when any object acquires new property, a new entity comes into existence. That would be kind of profligate. Or you could have more restricted views about maybe certain categories of properties. When something acquires them, a new entity comes into existence. I guess I'm not in favor of any of those general views. And, you know, statue, the lump of clay, you know, I say they're identical myself. And we can go into the arguments involving that. So that's in the background.
You and the singleton set of you surely don't think they're the same.
No, those are distinct, but that's not a matter of an object acquiring a new property, right? So the generation of entities from acquisition of new properties is the thing that I think we shouldn't buy into. You know, when a lump of clay acquires a certain shape and a certain history, it becomes a statue. It's got a new property. There's no new entity on the scene. There's just an old entity that has new properties. And that's the picture I have about corporations and institutional entities in general. There's a kind of counting problem involving institutions or organized groups, you know, the two committees that have the same members. But I think that they're just different things we're counting there. And the committees, you know, the one committee and the other committee are the same group. That's my view. But then we do want to distinguish, you know, the individuals operating in the one set of roles as opposed to operating in the other set of roles. And so that's where the language arises that makes it look like there's more than one committee around. That's more than one thing around. There are more details in the books.
Yeah, I know.
Nurbay Hocam?
So yeah, thank you for the talk. I wasn't going to ask a question which is mostly about the ontological side of the story, but kind of Bill opened up the gates. So I thought maybe I should just go ahead and ask. If I'm not mistaken, you said that you think that there are groups, right? So it's there are groups. These are kind of things in a sense. And then you had a story about, the levels of groups, and then, you have groups that have groups as their members. And at the end, of course, you have individuals. So, so I was wondering, what do you think of, can you say more about what groups are? Like, they're not just individuals, right? And I mean, the way in which you talked a bit about them seemed to imply that you think that they may be like sets, but it seems like set formation or set membership is not really appropriate for explaining the relation between groups and its members. So can you say a little more about what groups are supposed to be? That may help me a lot.
I think the concept of group I'm working with is one that's embedded in ordinary language. I take plural terms to refer to groups. They're a couple, I say. There's a group of 3 people sitting at that table, and so on. So these are ordinary notions. And it's, the notion of group here is not reducible to something else. So it's one of the, on my view, sort of basic part of our conceptual repertoire. We use it all the time, but groups are not sets. There's no empty group. There's no group of one person. I think the notion of group actually is probably for us more basic than the notion of set, and the notion of set is kind of abstraction from the notion of group. Groups are individuated extensionally, so they have that in common with sets, but groups have properties set don't have. So, a group of boxes can weigh more than any one of the individual boxes. But the set of the boxes, well, it's the boxes that have weight, not the set. So sets and groups are quite different in character, but I think the notion of group is more fundamental. And I'm just, in thinking about the character of groups, I'm just thinking about what is the structure of this concept that we deploy when we think about things. And it looks like, you can give arguments for the extensional identification of groups. You can give arguments for groups having properties like weight and taking up space and so on. And give arguments there being groups of groups, the competition between the group of ballroom dancers over here are involved in one competition, the group over here another, but the ballroom dancers consist of pairs of dancers. So all this is part of the ordinary way we have of thinking about groups. United Nations is a group of nations. American Advertising Association, American Advertising Agency is a group of groups. Corporations have shareholders that are both, institutions and individuals.
All right. And last question from Murali.
Hi, thanks, Kirk. I think I've just got a confused picture of what a proxy agent is. So let me just say why. I'm just wondering whether they really are genuinely proxies, because suppose you hire a spokesperson for yourself, they cock up the entire interview with the press. You don't take responsibility for that, you sack them. So it looks as if the proxy is only going in one direction. They're not really speaking for you, because otherwise you'd sack yourself or do something to yourself. Likewise with the CEO. I mean, so is there really a genuine proxy agent who is basically, whatever they do, you're responsible for?
Well, I didn't say that about proxy agents. Proxy agents are authorized, but they're authorized to do certain things and not other things. If I, hire somebody as a spokesperson and say, here's what I want you to say to the press, I'm giving instructions. If the spokesperson doesn't obey the instructions, then that person is not representing me, because the representation relation is connected with the instructions that I give to the spokesperson. Same thing goes for a power of attorney.
But I thought that you were allowing that the spokesperson could say whatever they said was on your behalf, as it were. It seemed to me that you were giving them sort of almost unrestricted ability to say things on your behalf. You're not doing that. Okay.
No, I did say that there is such thing as proxy agent autonomy, but that's not unrestricted. And that's something that's granted, but granted within certain limits. So you can, here's our view, go out and, explain it to the press. That doesn't mean you can change what the view is that you're explaining, right? That's stepping outside of the bounds of authority that you've been given.
Okay, thanks.
All right, thank you very much, Professor Ludwig.